All right. And there we are. We're live on What's Your Story? Hello and welcome everybody to What's Your Story? I am the life orchestrator millionaire, Dr. Varun Gandhi. Love and abundance, everybody. I love starting off with that little affirmation of love and abundance for everybody that's tuning in today. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Today, we have a special guest. He's Shahid Buttar. And the theme of this episode is called An Immigrant Defending America. Now, that's an interesting theme because usually we don't hear about immigrants having to defend a country. But here we have a special person who's taken it upon himself for the last about 20 years or so to defend the country of America and what we stand for. So let's find out more about what Shahid is all about. So Shahid is an American civil rights lawyer, an activist, and a perennial candidate best known for his primary challenges against Nancy Pelosi in representing California's 12th congressional district. His wide-ranging work reflects a commitment to intersectional feminism, democratic socialism, and international human rights. His passions have long aligned around a common purpose, and we're going to talk more about this. The common purpose is building the movement to put human rights and human needs before corporate profits. Such an important topic. He's also an advocate for marriage equality for same-sex couples and a prolific organizer in the movement to end warrantless government surveillance. Shahid most recently built a national grassroots network for the Electronic Frontier Foundation as the organization's Director of Grassroots Advocacy. Shahid, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. You know, it takes a special kind of person to be an activist. So I want to kind of find out, how did you get started and what's your story?
I appreciate that. I would push back a little bit. I don't think it does take a special person to be an activist. I think anybody who cares, frankly, is invited to activism. And, for me, the path to caring about our policies and our country and engaging in it really was forced on me. I think for a lot of people, existence is the pathway to resistance. That was true for anyone in the LGBTQ community, right, for a long time until we achieved some measure of acceptance. It's been true for immigrants in this country for a long time. It remains true for African Americans and indigenous people. And so if your existence is resistance, politics is simply the organized expression of that. And for me, I was in law school 20 years ago under the Bush administration when the Bush versus Gore decision, right when I got to school, frankly exposed the farce of what passes for law in this country. And then over the time I was there, I witnessed a set of horrific terror attacks, the knee-jerk response of a country blindly striking at its own constitution in a sort of frenzied fury to do something, even if ultimately in the service of the agenda of the people who attacked our country. Ultimately, I mean, we did more damage to America than any foreign, power ever did. And by the end of my law school time, this is 2000 to 2003 was when I was at Stanford. And Bush invaded Iraq the spring I graduated from law school. And so by the time that semester rolled around, I was pretty much full-time committed to organizing direct action to try to stop the war before it started, responding to the invasion afterward. I was teaching constitutional law as a teaching assistant during the day, and then organizing at night and, getting arrested on the weekends, basically. And witnessing not just the erosion of what passes for law in this country, but I had the honor and the privilege of being in the Bay Area at a time when it very frankly assertively expressed itself. I saw a one-day attempt, and we actually did, in fact, seize a major city. It wasn't a general strike, but it aimed at the same goals of demobilizing commerce as a way to force a set of objections to human rights abuses to the fore. And that frankly inspired me. I went to Washington's Capitol. As a young lawyer, I had a chance to defend campaign finance reform, advance marriage equality for LGBTQ couples. And while I was in Washington, I just witnessed the bipartisan erosion of our rights in every conceivable dimension. And the particular reason when I decided to run for office first in 2018, you described me as a perennial candidate, which is interesting. I would hardly describe myself that way. I've only run twice before. I'm about to launch my third run to replace Nancy Pelosi in the House. And the reason I ran for office is because, as a public interest advocate for 20 years, fighting issues from campaign finance reform to marriage equality to trying to stop surveillance, addressing immigration enforcement, predatory policing, I've just witnessed Democrats and Republicans alike pave the road to bipartisan authoritarianism. And it's not okay by a long shot. And the particular person who leads the Democrats in the House, Nancy Pelosi, is an active agent of it and has been for decades. And the very same city that trained me how to resist has been misrepresented in Washington for an entire generation by a tool of the military industrial complex that this city existentially opposes. That we don't live in an East Coast city. I mean, San Francisco is a proud cultural capital of the country, and we have carved a very different path than the rest of the country. We are proudly committed to visionary values. The United Nations was founded in our city. We are proudly committed to human rights, and we are represented in Washington by people who literally could go to The Hague to face justice if our country ever accepted the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And just to compound that, we have the further corruption of these very same officials punching down and left at refugees in Congress. A Black Muslim woman, I'm thinking of Ilhan Omar, on the rare occasion that she actually speaks or dares to speak the truth. Well, she speaks the truth quite frequently, but the rare occasion that a member of Congress stands for the truth, she's attacked by her own leadership. And the fact that we have two political parties in Washington, not just one, this is not a GOP versus Democratic problem, because the Democrats are absolutely up to their necks in the same problems. And when we have that sort of dynamic where there isn't a seemingly available electoral choice that is actually aligned with our constitutional principles, not just and I'll shut up after this, but when I think about those constitutional principles, I think about the right to dissent, which means effectively nothing in this day and age, given the way that the law is arrayed against people who raise their voices to defend certain principles. Thinking about the way our system denies basic human rights, from the right to make it home at night without getting shot by a cop to the right to see a doctor and get medical care. We don't even have the same rights in the United States that people in other countries do, yet we smugly talk about leading the free world. We're not even in the free world. And part of my project is to help democratize the United States and liberate a country that talks a big game about freedom while frankly failing to understand anything about what the word means. And I'm inspired by our founding values. I'm inspired by the words that we've written in paper, by the words that we've carved in stone in some cases, and they mean too much to me to turn a blind eye to them and walk along a path that we've seen trod in the world before. I've studied history enough to understand the context that we are in today. And if you understand the context that we are in, if you understand these moments, it's not enough to merely observe and watch. I think the demand of citizenship is that we engage and take action to stand on the shoulders of the people who came before and prepare the landscape for those who are coming, to do what we can to support timeless values, liberty, freedom, inclusion, opportunity, peace, justice, at a time when they are all unfortunately in exile.
Wow. You started off at the very beginning about how the Iraq War, and you were kind of going through law school at that time. So that was a time when I just moved to the country from United Arab Emirates 2 months before 9/11.
Wow.
And
wild timing.
Wild. Yep. So July 2001. So this July will be 20 years of my anniversary of moving to America.
Okay. Welcome. Happy anniversary.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's like you mentioned, it's come down to an immigrant defending America. Why has it come down to that?
Well, I'd say immigrants. I'm certainly not the only one. And right. I can think of any number of Americans also who stand in this line. I mean, maybe this wouldn't be a bad place to reflect on the passing of a former U.S. senator who we lost yesterday, Mike Gravel. And I wouldn't say it's just immigrants. I mean, he's an American, born in the U.S. He served in the U.S. Senate for decades representing Alaska. And he helped bring down the Nixon administration before running for the presidency twice. And his legacy is profound. And it's frankly the very same things that inspired him, the very same things that inspired Edward Snowden, the very same things that inspired Paul Revere, the very same things that inspired Emma Goldman are the same things that inspire me. And those are the opportunities for people to live a free existence, free of authoritarian social control, free of the domination of corporate capital, free to live our purposes and be self-actualized beings. That's the opportunity that I think a liberatory politics represents. It's frankly the vision that I think our founders nodded towards in rhetoric, while, of course, in principle, executing a genocide and international slavery. So, far cries from sincere reflections of their stated principles, but the principles are priceless. And I think, it fell to, I've just done what needed to be done ultimately. So I don't want to say that the entire system, collapsed and everybody ran for the hills, though I've seen many Americans, do the hard work of standing up for justice at this time. And the people I'd particularly center as I describe that are, for instance, the people in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. I grew up in St. Louis County. I graduated from high school just about 20 minutes by drive from Ferguson. And socioculturally, it might have been as well been on the other end of the earth. And to experience so vast a set of disparities within the same county, let alone across our country, is revealing. And the fact that it was entirely dispossessed, vulnerable people fearing for their lives, taking action in the street to alert the rest of us that our police departments have been paramilitarized and are killing Americans wantonly. That's basically the story of the United States at the moment. That happened by our most powerless neighbors. They're the ones who forced a national reckoning 7 years ago that is continuing today. And that to me is an inspiring illustration of what we the people mean, right? That we the people are not the muckety mucks in Congress. It's not the millionaires who are writing policy to fill their pockets. It's the people of the United States. That's who we, with a capital W, are. And that's who I aim to represent. I'm incredibly inspired by seeing Cori Bush go to Congress. She now represents the district where I graduated from high school. And I came to California 21 years ago from the Midwest, admiring the roots and the history of this place. And I've gotten so deeply steeped in it. And I'm frankly a little bit ashamed that San Francisco is represented by a voice as conservative as Nancy Pelosi, when the place that I grew up in, Missouri, has an intersectional liberation agent representing them in Washington. I mean, it is profound. It is, again, shameful to a city like San Francisco. And it's, damn well time that it changed. And we got a voice in Washington aligned with our city who will actually go to bat, who has gone to bat for the human rights, peace and justice, inclusion, LGBTQ rights principles that have long united this proud, visionary city.
You mentioned at the very beginning of Senator Mike Gravel, right, him passing. Can we take a moment to kind of talk about his significance in bringing down the Nixon administration?
Absolutely. There was a key case. He was one of the named parties, Gravel versus United States. He read thousands of pages of a classified military analysis known widely as the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record. Now, he did this at a time when our government, under the Nixon administration, was trying to do everything it possibly could to keep the document out of the public's hands. It was a long secret document in the first place, leaked by a government whistleblower, a renowned national hero described by Nixon as the most dangerous man in America. His name is Daniel Ellsberg. He's still with us, quite politically active. In fact, he spoke on the 50th anniversary of his releasing the Pentagon Papers just a few weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. And one of the points he made was that the comparable records, the secret military histories that would reveal the actual origins of the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan have never been released. And it's interesting because he's making this point that what he started so many years ago is a project that remains unfinished today. There was a point, maybe it would have been 10, 11 years ago, there was a documentary filmed about him, Daniel Ellsberg. It was nominated for an Emmy or an Oscar, I get them confused. And it's called The Most Dangerous Man in America. And this film, he talks about how he had aimed to participate in the production of that film to inspire other government whistleblowers to follow his lead, to come forward with secret documents that they might find that indicate criminality, that show the abdication, right, of our officials' oaths of offices. And it was just a few years after the production of that documentary that a young man by the name of Edward Snowden came forward and later credited Daniel Ellsberg with inspiring him. Daniel Ellsberg's principal ally on Capitol Hill was U.S. Senator Mike Gravel, who stood against the Nixon administration, fought for the public's right to know, to challenge the Pentagon's lies to the public and expose the real history of why we were in Vietnam, which Daniel Ellsberg summarized the other day as extending the French colonial project of denying self-determination to a country in East Asia that had long sought it. And this idea of the United States despite our rhetoric of freedom and democracy, being complicit in effectively imperialism, denying self-determination to other peoples. It's worth noting that the Declaration of Independence in Vietnam quoted our own. They quoted the US Declaration of Independence, and then we invaded. And the hypocrisy, not just of the principles here, but we're talking about 50,000 dead Americans, and millions of people dead across an entire region that we carpet bombed while lying about it. And I visited Vietnam a few years ago. I had an opportunity to explore a couple museums dedicated to the American War. And I grew up in St. Louis, right? St. Louis happens to be the headquarters of Monsanto. Many people know Monsanto as an international agriculture company that basically abuses the biosphere by propertizing any number of, for instance, genetically modified organisms, and then even suing farmers who don't ask for them to end up on their land. I mean, it's gross in every conceivable dimension. But when I learned about Monsanto's history in Vietnam, it turned my stomach. I mean, we were talking about an agricultural company that is a weapons contractor and was actively promoting our Pentagon was using as a tool of war ecocide. In this day and age, the idea that we were just destroying jungles wantonly, it is 2 generations, 3 generations later, and people still are being born without limbs because we in the United States can't be bothered to show up for our own values. We can't be bothered to do the oversight of our military to know when we're actually defending the United States or when we're simply projecting our illegitimate imperial interests internationally. Just yesterday, last night, the United States bombed Syria and Iraq. And the claim was it was in self-defense. How are we defending ourselves by bombing a country halfway around the world? I would love for someone to explain that to me. It is absolutely preposterous. And frankly, I don't want to say it's just frustrating because that vastly understates the point. But 20 years ago, I was trying to stop an invasion of Iraq, and we find ourselves effectively in the exact same place an entire generation later. Why do we keep walking the same path? That's why it falls to immigrants to defend America, because America, unfortunately, I think has lost track of the principles that unite our country. We have them written, embodied in a document called a Constitution, to which every member of Congress swears an oath. And it seems to be the case that most of them don't even understand it well enough to show up when it matters. And I care too much, basically, to look away. And that's why I'm running to replace the most powerful Democrat in the House. That's why I see so many other people rising up in so many different ways, from the streets to nonprofit jobs. The few journalists who are worth their salt and actually check their facts before practicing government stenography. Those are people who are all engaged in the same struggle to defend timeless rights and principles at a time when not just we, the people of the United States, but I dare say the people of Earth need us to defend human rights and democracy and transparency here in this country.
There are many people that are doing the work of activism and protecting freedom and our speech in America. But then there are a lot more people who are on the other side of, I just don't care, right? They're kind of just passive, letting it happen. What can we tell them to kind of bring them on the activism side to get involved in whichever way that they seem fit?
The most jarring thing that I've heard someone say that might cleave through the cognitive dissonance of someone who doesn't understand what's happening is that in the 1930s, many Germans thought that they were free too. Nobody tells you when fascism arrives. It doesn't declare itself. It just reveals itself over and over again. And it has in this country. Everything from the ridiculous displays of patriotic pride. I'm thinking about like every one of the air demonstration teams from the armed services that perform these stunts at ridiculous cost to cheering crowds, oblivious to the ways in which the way we spend our resources undermine our own rights. I would particularly zero in on the January 6th insurrection here and the response to it. And a couple points to make. First, anybody who claims to be surprised by what happened shouldn't be in office, because there was nothing about that was a surprise. Whistleblowers have been warning for 17 years. FBI whistleblowers have been warning for 17 years that the right wing had catastrophic plots, including attacks on major cities. And because Congress doesn't pay attention to whistleblowers, they would prefer to prosecute them and vilify them than actually listen to what they say. Everybody in Congress in 2021 is like, oh, nobody could have ever guessed this was happening. That's total lies. And we shouldn't believe it for a second. The people who act surprised declare their unfitness to serve, period. Further, in the wake of that catastrophic event, and I think it did rightfully alarm any number of people. I'm not going to say it was okay. It was ridiculous. It was absolutely absurd. We waste $750 billion with a T every year on defense. We're supposedly defending the country now by bombing Syria and Iraq. Where was the defense when the Capitol was under siege for 4 hours in broad daylight in the middle of a weekday afternoon? I mean, honestly, the corruption is just absolutely astounding that anybody takes this seriously anymore. But in the wake of it, this is the part I want to focus on. Many members of Congress were afraid. And FDR told us that fear is the mind killer, to paraphrase Dune there. You know, it is the fear itself that we must fear. And the fear of Congress seems to be inclining members to vote for security measures entirely untethered from the problem. The problem is not an inadequate budget for the Capitol Police Department, which just got a massive raise recently, a reward for failure. The problem is not budgets, it's not authorities. The problem, in the case of the January insurrection, was the Pentagon and the security services showing up for work. The answer to that is to fire a bunch of people, and that hasn't happened. It happened at the Capitol Police, but you know, there's a whole bunch of people in Washington who are complicit, not just in human rights abuses, but in this case, actually abandoning Congress and failing the defense mandate that we pay them good money for. Mm-hmm. And you know, Congress's willingness to abandon its own interests, to not defend itself, to abdicate basically to military industrial corruption, that explains both why it took Mike Gravel to stand forward and to help end the Vietnam War, and it explains why the January 6th insurrection has been co-opted on both sides of the partisan aisle as a pretext to extend and enhance security that ultimately undermines security, that undermines our rights, that undermine dissent, that divert resources from crucially needed social programs. Every dollar in the budgets of police departments is part of the problem. You know, we have, and police embody authoritarianism, literally, even before they were paramilitarized. I mean, a story came up when I had the opportunity to meet the brother and father of Julian Assange here in the Bay Area this weekend. That his prosecution represents also almost in a way inverse to the passage of Mike Gravel. If the passage of Mike Gravel reminds us of an inspiring moment when figures stood up for transparency and fought the U.S. government on behalf of the public's right to know and human rights, you know, the prosecution of Julian Assange represents how little progress we've ultimately made, because we are now today fighting a simple battle to know the truth. And people forget who Assange was because he's been politicized under the Trump administration in the context of his most recent leaks. But it's important to consider history here. And I want to remind people what Assange did under the Bush administration, which was very specifically reveal a military cover-up to stop anyone from knowing that the US military had assassinated a pair of Reuters journalists in Iraq mercilessly. And then their soldiers laughing about it in the video. And no one saw that video until WikiLeaks released it. And if you haven't seen the collateral murder video, I would invite you to check it out. This is why Chelsea Manning went to prison. So in the same way that Gravel and Ellsberg worked together to try to defend the public from the machinations of the Defense Department and the military industrial complex under Nixon, Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange worked together to try to expose the corruption of the Iraq War. And instead of us doing what we did under Nixon, getting a criminal president out of office, we doubly committed to the Iraq War. We threw the whistleblower in prison. Nancy Pelosi, who represents San Francisco and Washington, the city where the UN was founded, instead of impeaching George Bush, continued to fund his wars. And so we see this sort of loss of the era of Mike Gravel to stepping into this era of bipartisan authoritarianism, and the key role of a figure like Speaker Pelosi as leading the Democratic Party, but instead of opposing the executive branch as he's constitutionally required to do, or politically supposedly supposed to do, because at the time, it was a Republican president, she went along serving a Republican president, not just then, but under the Trump administration too. I saw over the last 4 years, the most powerful Democrat in the House run around the country trying to claim that she was fighting Trump while she was paving the road for every one of his policies, funding his concentration camps at the border, approving his corporate trade deals, expanding his surveillance powers in the very same week that she was impeaching him. Don't get me started on the sheer hypocrisy of this. And, one level at which I feel, frankly, this is beyond January 6th, but when we're talking about democracy under threat, one way in which I see that being embodied is quite literally in the figure of the speaker, who hasn't debated anyone since 1987. How democratic a country are we, or a party are we, when we're led by figures that haven't debated since many of their constituents were born? I mean, it's farcical. No one looking at the facts could claim anything about democracy looking at the United States. It's all just words on paper. And I'm eager to make the words mean something in practice.
What you mentioned Nancy Pelosi not opposing the war in Iraq. What was why? What did she gain from doing that?
When Eisenhower in 1961, he coined the term the military-industrial complex in the last speech he gave to the American public, after helping win the Second World War as the Supreme Allied Commander, after building the interstate highway system, pivotal figure in American history. His last speech warns that a combination of security and profit will threaten democracy in America, that it will erode our rights unless we remain knowledgeable and alert. Knowledgeable and alert were his words, direct quote. We are neither knowledgeable in any meaningful way, that's the government secrecy I'm talking about, and we are certainly far from alert, right? I mean, we tend to respond to things about 10 years after the fact in this country, and largely because the government suppresses most of the information in the time, and our state-run, I should say, not owned, but state-controlled media in the United States tend to defer to government officials about what they let the public know about. I could tell a very, very poignant story about the New York Times in 2004 swinging the election for Bush by refusing to report the facts. The bald politicization of journalism, and that also is a crisis for democracy. But when I think about the Iraq War and members of Congress and the interest in militarism, what Eisenhower was referring to, in fact, one of the early drafts of his speech referred to a military-industrial congressional complex. And he ended up taking the word congressional out of the speech. But the point is that industry has an interest in war. War is very profitable. That's why policymakers support it. And it's profitable not only for industry, but it's ultimately profitable for them, the policymakers. Nancy Pelosi is worth over $200 million. She's the seventh wealthiest member of Congress. Wow. And she hasn't debated since 1987. So just put that set of things together. I mean, we're talking about rule not only by the wealthy, but she's also a dynasty politician. She was born with a silver spoon in her mouth to a family who, her father was the mayor of Baltimore during an era when the city was notoriously mobbed up. Her nephew is currently the governor of California. And two different news outlets have reported that if she does ever retire, they're going to run her daughter in her place. And if there's anything that offends me more than bipartisan authoritarianism or corporate rule running humanity off a cliff, it is the idea of inherited political office in a proud democracy that fought a revolution against the United Kingdom to establish an anti-nobility clause. I was born in the UK and I immigrated to the United States. And the idea that we are practicing the same feudal, inherited political power transmission practices of the country that we revolted from 200 years ago is frankly shameful. It's shameful for everyone, not just me or the Pelosi's. And I want to make this really sharp just to get it across. And this is an illustration not only of the corruption of the establishment and the particular figure who I confront electorally, but also the crisis in journalism in the United States, where, again, our state-controlled media refuses to publish facts. 2 weeks ago, a Black Muslim woman in Congress, Ilhan Omar, thoughtfully welcomed the United States to recognize and accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. It's a body that was set up to enforce international human rights laws. We in the United States have never allowed the International Criminal Court to prosecute U.S. officials because we insist that we can do no wrong. So many things here. The part that I want to focus on is that after Ilhan Omar simply suggests that we recognize international law, the entire Democratic leadership condemns her. Led by Nancy Pelosi, they write a letter saying that Ilhan's remarks were offensive, that she was drawing some false equivalency between, for instance, the CIA and Hamas. And there's so many things to unpack here. The first is that there's only one country in the history of the world to use weapons of mass destruction to kill hundreds of thousands of unarmed civilians at once. We did that twice. There's only one country in the world that incarcerates as many people of its own as we do, right? There's only one country in the world that has military bases in 180 countries around it. The idea that we are in a position in any meaningful way to talk about human rights as if we respect them is a joke. And the fact of the matter, not only is that there's certainly no false equivalency between the CIA and Hamas. So the CIA has done far, far more to topple democracies around the world and undermine human rights, promote ecocide. I could go on. But the point I really want to focus on, that nobody, not a single journalist in this country, had the independence to reflect upon. And it's not like I wasn't saying it at every conceivable opportunity as her election challenger. Nancy Pelosi in 2006 was read into what the CIA called enhanced interrogation. That's the sanitized word for torture, baldly violating international commitments that we fought a world war to establish. Just like the International Criminal Court is part of what we won the Second World War to establish, and then decided we weren't going to play the game, right? What that means in terms of the Convention Against Torture, I want to explain how it relates to Pelosi learning in 2006 about enhanced interrogation. The Convention Against Torture, which we're a signatory to, imposes a mandatory affirmative obligation on all states to investigate and prosecute all credible allegations of torture, which is to say, if you learn that it's happening and you cover it up, as the Democratic Speaker of the House has done for 15 years, that's a violation of international law, separate from, independent of, and beyond the underlying torture itself. In other words, if we did ever accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, not only would the entire senior leadership of the CIA have to fear justice in The Hague, so would House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in her individual self. So as she's writing letters condemning a Black Muslim woman refugee in Congress for speaking the truth, she is hiding, and the press is facilitating, no one knowing that the individuals writing the letter have individual conflicts of interest, not just the institutional corruption of the military-industrial complex. I mean the individual 1.0, cover your ass, keep me out of prison kind of corruption. And it's one thing for that to go down in public, but how, in a free country with a free press, does not a single journalist expose the truth? That's what I find myself particularly alarmed at the moment, is that we not only are hurling ourselves into an era of bipartisan authoritarianism, mass surveillance without checks or balances, predatory policing, lethal state violence with generally impunity, notwithstanding at least a single verdict of a single cop recently that people, I think, were grateful to see and also not in any way satisfied by. These dimensions of authoritarianism, executive secrecy come to mind, or bombing other countries like we did last night. All of these sorts of practices are bad enough, but when you can't find a journalist to talk about them and people don't know that it's happening, that is how democracy dies. And I can't underscore enough the critical importance of ethical journalism at a time like this. And that means journalists have to show up for work. They have to cover stories, important stories. They have to call whistleblowers. They have to do the work of investigating that has fallen so far out of favor. I mean, I think about the crisis in journalism as bad as the crisis in executive power. It's enabled the crisis in executive power. They've become a helix now. And so we have an intersectional erosion and assault on democracy at the same time. And that's the context in which we find ourselves in 2021, fighting a climate crisis, fighting a military-industrial complex, trying to maintain a fidelity to principles that the corporate voices in Washington refuse to heed or even acknowledge. And I think it falls to everybody who recognizes these timeless principles or recognizes the landscape in which we are operate. Every person of conscience who understands what is happening, I think, is needed on the front line, whatever that means, whether the front line is online, whether the front line is your neighborhood community, whether the front line is some campaign. Do something. This is such a critical time for people to engage, to defend not just this country and not just the principles that we brag about, but values that transcend all of us, that transcend our generations, that transcend our nation, values, frankly, that will determine whether or not the future has an opportunity to exist and survive and hopefully thrive. And that's the challenge and the burden of our generation, is to keep the door open for the future and to stop the past from killing it before it emerges.
Essentially creating policies that keep the we in the mind, not the establishment, but the people, the we, the W, the capital W, right? You mentioned how journalists are in a way not stepping up, because I look at it as, the management of these media companies are in a way with the state run or state side, right? They're siding with the state. So journalists have to basically go against a lot of establishment in their corporation, in their system. So they have to break the mold, step outside of their little comfort zone and write these stories, because I'm sure they face a lot of opposition when in publishing these stories. So what can we kind of tell these journalists? What kind of motivation can we give them
Mm.
to to publish these, to take that step of, hey, I'm not going to side with the media establishment, but I'm going to report the truth that may expose establishment, that may expose my own company and keep my job at a risk, right? Put my job at a risk.
Right. There's at least two different layers to offer here. One is, what we might say to journalists, and then there's a whole other arena in terms of, the battles that journalists face themselves that I think you're correctly alluding to. And maybe I'll start there. There's a really interesting, and I say that, with all of its connotations, opportunity and also crisis embodied in it, interesting moment in journalism, where we're seeing the delegitimation of many of the mainstream outlets that do things like suppressing whistleblowers and not covering the facts, and the emergence of journalists on platforms like Substack who are eating their lunch. I think about Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, who recently left The Hill to launch their own independent platform, and their traffic is frankly bigger than the institutional platform that they left. I think about the Daily Poster and David Sirota in Colorado and the team of journalists that they're hiring around the country to do the work that the New York Times just won't do. And just to be clear, there's this canard you'll hear from mainstream media sources like the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle. Oh, there's some value to institutional press because we check our facts. That is absolute and complete, pardon me, horseshit. And I'll give you a couple examples. 2004, the New York Times hears from a whistleblower here at San Francisco, Mark Klein. He discovers the AT&T building switching the cables. He discovers mass surveillance that Edward Snowden revealed 8 years before. But the New York Times wouldn't tell the story. They sat on it because the Bush administration wanted them to. They said, when they were finally asked, this is appalling, the editors of the New York Times said, well, we didn't want to print the story because we didn't want to shift the election. What is the point of journalism or elections if not to inform people so they can make informed choices? Here in San Francisco, I've seen the San Francisco Chronicle show up. I don't even know if the Chronicle's even written this story yet. So there's a particular member of the Board of Supervisors. His name is Aaron Peskin. He was recently outed for 20 years of public berating behavior, abusing his staff and people appearing before him, just, wantonly disrespectful behavior. And it took 20 years for anyone in the press to cover it. I'm an immigrant challenging entrenched power. I'm not a bad boss. I'm good to people. There were a bunch of Democratic Party operatives who worked for me at one point who made up a bunch of lies, a bunch of fabrications. And the San Francisco Chronicle, because it doesn't check its facts, printed stories straight out of the Jim Crow South. Accusations not just by staff analogous to that kind of issue we were talking about before, but vicious kinds of smears. I was accused in writing by Democratic Party operatives of sexual harassment and assault that they acknowledged was a mistake the first time that any journalist asked them about it, and it took 2 months. And so I would just ask, when it takes 2 months for journalists to investigate stories that they've already published, and the double standards that are constructed both by the writings and the omissions, basically taking 20 years to cover real stories about incumbents and fabricating them about challengers, this is a crisis not just for the subjects of this journalism. This is a crisis for democracy, because when the voters are misled by the newspapers of record, we frankly should welcome other platforms like Substack and independent journalists who are doing the job that their institutional counterparts, for whatever reason, have found themselves unable to do. I want to zero in on a particular piece that you noted in the tension between journalists and editors. When I talk about journalistic ethics and journalists for showing up for work, the particular people I'm thinking of are editors. I think many journalists get into the game with a positive goal of bringing information to the public and cultivating debate and discourse. And ultimately, the biggest constraint on them are editors who decide, this is newsworthy, that's not. And I got to tell you, if you judge editors based on the things that the papers actually write about and that they don't write about, to describe the media in the United States as state controlled, I think is entirely legitimate. And it's shameful that we have a media that is effectively state controlled, even though they're independently, privately run. That's a symbol, a reflection of fascism, not just in the dimension of executive secrecy, but also the private public distinction eroding, the idea that private actors come to operate with effectively public influence. That's part of fascism, the monopolization and accretion of power industrially in different sectors like that. I'm chasing a rabbit now. There was a further point I wanted to make that slipped out of my head at some point, but hopefully that gets at least part of your question across.
Yeah, that does. That definitely does. You mentioned, kind of touched upon government surveillance, and I want to take a deep dive into what ways are government surveillance interfering with our lives, and how can we as citizens or netizens, what can we do to stop the surveillance, or how can we take action in what ways?
2, maybe 3 big buckets here to lay out, because the strategies are different depending on which landscape we're operating in. So there's the national security kind of surveillance, which is pervasive. I want to set that aside for a minute. There's the local government surveillance, which is also pervasive and presents its own opportunities. And then there's private sector surveillance, which isn't government at all, but gets co-opted again in the same service of the fascist fusion of public and private that I was describing before. So let's talk about private, then we'll go to federal intelligence agencies, then we'll go to local police. Privately, in private commerce, let's say, or online, the biggest threats to privacy, the biggest vectors of surveillance are companies that want to sell you advertising, because surveillance is part of the business model in Silicon Valley as it was constructed a decade ago. There's a thoughtful and insightful author by the name of Shoshana Zuboff with a book, Surveillance Capitalism, which really unpacks this and lays it out. And the principal agents of this dynamic that come to mind are companies like Facebook, which want to monitor what you, the user, does so that they can better target ads to you. But what, in the service of building that ad delivery machine, what they basically built was a brainwashing system that Donald Trump used very effectively. That's not just surveillance. It's worse than that, right? And so to reduce it to surveillance is frankly being very charitable. What we're talking about in the context of Facebook is something between social control, social steering, the selective presentation of information, and here's the key, completely arbitrary, ultimately unaccountable, random corporate decision-making that subjects billions of people around the world to whatever the whims of its founder are. And that's a public governance problem. That's an antitrust problem. And so the solution to the problem of online companies facilitating mass surveillance, the solution there is an antitrust solution, and to embrace innovation to build other platforms that aren't practicing the same kind of predatory behavior. I should tell a quick story here, while we're in this bucket, before I move back to the government surveillance. For many years ago, I would have been probably the better part of 15 years ago, I'd imagine, 2007, 2008, Facebook's original value proposition was that we're like MySpace, but we care about your privacy more. That was the claim at the time. And look at how well that worked out, which is to say we can't trust marketing. And we also have to trust that any dominant actor in any given era will attempt to entrench itself. Now, I had my first job offer since I started law school in 2001 was to join the Justice Department's antitrust division. And I ended up declining it because the antitrust division was shut down under the Bush administration, and it's never been open for business since, meaningfully. Just this year, one of the few things I will give Joe Biden credit for, because I'm not a fan, he's way too conservative for this moment. He represents absolutely the worst aspects of the Democratic Party. He's the closest thing the Democratic Party has to Trump, and he proves it every day, from kids in camps to bombing Syria and Iraq last night. But one thing that Joe Biden has frankly done thoughtfully is appoint Lena Khan as the now chair of the Federal Trade Commission. She was an academic at Columbia Law School, outspoken critic of the tech companies, and she pioneered an understanding of how to more aggressively enforce existing antitrust laws. At around the same time, just a few weeks ago, several members of Congress, including Pramila Jayapal, the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, and several other members of Congress, introduced a series, almost half a dozen bills, to strengthen antitrust law, to create new laws for the FTC and the Justice Department to enforce. I'm very proud of those bills because several of them reflect proposals I've long made around increasing merger scrutiny, preventing companies from acquiring their competition to buy and then kill it from ever reaching the market. There are other things I've proposed here that I'd like to see Congress do, like statutorily codifying the essential facilities doctrine, which would be frankly radical with respect to ensuring innovation and putting consumers before companies. All that's a bit of a digression from the surveillance piece. I just want to note that the solutions in the online private company effectuated surveillance arena, those solutions are mostly about building alternatives to the companies and checking and balancing them. So that's antitrust to keep them from growing and supporting other market entrants to displace the dominant power, for instance, of Facebook, slash Instagram, slash all of its other, or Google, slash YouTube, the conglomerates effectively, which have come to dominate our lives online. Now let's pivot back to federal government surveillance before we go to local government surveillance. When we talk about federal government surveillance, people immediately think about the NSA. I would, for what it's worth, recommend a song I produced in 2014 as a teaching tool called NSA versus USA. And the point here is that it's not just the NSA, it's the FBI too, it's ICE, it's CBP, it's the DNI. It is, one could recite for hours the acronyms of duplicative, fraudulent, wasteful agencies in Washington pursuing an ultimately unconstitutional mission. And this gets back to the question you asked me about maybe 15 minutes ago. Why did Nancy Pelosi support the Iraq War or the war in Afghanistan or the continued military corruption embodied in last night's airstrikes? And because, just like surveillance, there is a ton of money in it. It's all about money. This is capitalism eroding democracy. It is exactly what Eisenhower told us to fear, the combination of security and profit. And anytime you see security and profit together, it goes off the rails. I'm going to come back to that theme when we get to local policing in a minute. So when we look at these federal agencies, the key there is to insist on transparency, because there's none at all. The last time anyone in Congress investigated these agencies was in 1976. Coming out of that investigation, they found serial wanton crimes. They wrote 3 books about it, and they created 2 committees, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which Nancy Pelosi chaired for a time, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which Dianne Feinstein, also from San Francisco, chaired for a time. I could chase a rabbit here about the tension between the 2 of them on torture. Feinstein is no friend to human rights, but the one time, just like I give Joe Biden very little credit, but I would acknowledge it with Lena Khan, the one thing I'd give Dianne Feinstein credit for is under the Bush administration, under the Obama administration, she took to the Senate floor to decry a constitutional crisis over torture, which Nancy Pelosi continues to cover up. So it was interesting to see daylight between these 2 very rich white women from San Francisco who play outside roles in insulating federal intelligence agencies from constitutional scrutiny and democratic transparency. But the key there, again, is fighting for information. It's why, for instance, the prosecution of Assange is so important. When Eisenhower told us to be knowledgeable and alert, we can't be knowledgeable if publishers are being prosecuted for publishing state secrets. How are we supposed to be knowledgeable if the press can't report the facts, or if the press won't report the facts? This is all in that same dimension. So fighting for transparency is layer 1. 2 is accountability. In this institutional context, what accountability looks like, and this will nod back at our discussion about the January 6th insurrection, accountability looks like rewarding failure with costs, with transferring authorities, limiting budgets, making agencies pay prices when they violate rights or fail on the job, instead of rewarding failure with ever-increasing budget increases and expansions of authorities. That's been Congress's response. That's why police departments are sucking all of the budgets out of every major city in America, because we reward failure institutionally. When of course, when it's individually, we throw people up and lock away the key. I want to tell just a quick vignette in this government surveillance arena that's going to connect it to local policing, and then I'll sort of jump buckets and talk about the unique solutions available there. And forgive me for being somewhat centering myself here, but I have a story from 2015 that sort of positions me at the intersection of those 2 issues. So this is February 2015. I just come back to DC. I was living there at the time, leading a civil rights organization called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. It's now known as Defending Rights and Dissent. I sit on the board. So when I was the executive director, came back from a trip, I was speaking somewhere, and it was like late at night. I woke up that morning and got a message from a friend who was working at Code Pink that the Director of National Intelligence at the time, James Clapper was his name, that he was testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, chaired at the time by the late Senator John McCain. So I jump up, put on a suit, run to Capitol Hill, sit in this hearing, listen to the whole thing. Nobody asks him. Nobody in the Senate asks James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, to account for this moment, 2 years before he had infamously misled the Senate under oath, he was asked by Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, is the NSA monitoring millions of Americans? James Clapper infamously says, no, not wittingly. He was exposed as a liar by Edward Snowden, who we talked about before. And again, this gets back to being knowledgeable and alert. So basically, the senior Obama administration official is lying to Congress and the public about mass surveillance. In one time slice, 2 years later, he's appearing before the Senate before, and nobody asks him. Not a single senator has the independence to ask, well, didn't you just lie to us 2 years ago about something else? So after the hearing's over, as he's walking out, I do a lot of writing, and I was going to write an article about this. I wanted to get a quote from Clapper. So I stand up, I said, Director Clapper, 2 years ago, you misled the Senate under oath about mass surveillance. What do you have to say to communities of color that are so hyper-policed that we're subjected to extrajudicial assassination for selling loose cigarettes? That's Eric Garner in New York, who said, I can't breathe, as he was dying on camera, on footage watched by millions of people years before George Floyd. It's not as if George Floyd happened in isolation. The exact same thing happened just a few years before. And so I asked James Clapper, what do you say to communities that are so hyper-policed that we're getting killed in the streets for selling loose cigarettes when you're lying to Congress and walking out of here with a pension and an entourage? And I walked out of the room in handcuffs. That's the state of dissent and transparency in this country. And to bring it now full circle to local police, when people think about surveillance, they fear the things that Snowden revealed. When you think about surveillance, think about the cops, and particular body cameras, because body cameras on police aren't accountability devices. Body cameras on police are tools on which facial recognition algorithms can be applied to basically put 1 million points of geographic surveillance on the street. When you look at local police, they are you could think of surveillance as a pincer. There's a high-tech sort of like component running online and running through any number of sophisticated tools, like listening devices like ShotSpotter, or the kind of tools that police use to map license plates automatically. Then there's also this street level surveillance, which not only includes the electronic tools, but the idea of leveraging local police and the million agents that are on the street around the country as tools of government surveillance. It's low tech and it's high tech at the same time. And it's federal and it's local at the same time. And while the federal government is a tough nut to crack, I'm running against Pelosi in order to try to force this conversation about federal surveillance, right? Local surveillance is much easier to address because you don't have to flip Congress. You just have to flip your city council. And so I worked on the first of the measures across the country to restrain the secret acquisition of surveillance technology by local police departments. That bill was passed in Santa Clara County, California in 2016. I've been quite active in building that movement around the country over a decade. I advocated for the first ban on facial recognition software adopted here in San Francisco in the spring of 2019. This movement across the country to restrain local police and subject them to democratic oversight at the local level aims to effectively create at the municipal and state layer exactly the kind of oversight that I'm running for office to impose at the federal layer. And it's not to say that the principles are different, but the action tracks are different. The targets are different. If in the federal context, the people you want to be, for instance, writing your letters to and your letters to the editor of the newspaper about are federal officials, people like Pelosi and Feinstein, who put the intelligence agencies before their constituents, people who swear oaths of office to the Constitution without even understanding what it means, people who've been in office in their cases for over 30 years, yet forgot the warning that Eisenhower gave us to be knowledgeable and alert, people who are ultimately actively facilitating the anti-democratic assault on our Constitution by executive secrecy. I could wax philosophic on that. But at the same time, we have to direct our letters to the editor of publications and our letters to those office holders of those people. In the local context, it's way easier because city council members and state legislators, they don't have nearly as many people beating down their doors as members of Congress do. So you can actually get to them often, especially, and I'll just, this is like a quick civics 101 lesson. If you're concerned watching this and you want to do something useful to help your community grapple with these questions more thoughtfully, just write a letter explaining your concerns, and however, they come to you. Don't think you have to have expertise, just explain how you feel and take that letter to your neighbors. Get 5 of your neighbors to sign it and then send it to your city council people. And you will get a completely different response. You'll get a meeting. You can meet somebody, hold on to their card, continue contacting them, harass them thoughtfully and politely, right? So heed your concerns and bake them into legislation. Being an engaged citizen advocate on behalf of not just your own voice, but even just a small group of your neighbors can be hyper empowering. And particularly at the local level, because again, the countervailing forces are much different. The military industrial complex is somewhat entrenched. It's very entrenched and somewhat inexorable federally. It is not entrenched locally. So there's opportunity there still to breathe life into our democracy and to defend it where the rubber hits the road, as it were. I know that was a super long answer. Thank you.
No, that was great. It brought a lot of insights into how to make change, especially at the local level, because I think that's where it all starts.
Yes.
In your local communities. You mentioned so most of the senior members of the Democratic Party being, in a sense, part of the establishment. So so far, the Democratic Party has that identity of, most of the leaders are from the establishment, and that's what's kind of leading their identity of the Democratic Party. So, what do you see as the new identity of the Democratic Party? Now I feel like there's some change happening in it, and how much involvement would the progressives have in that identity, shaping that identity of the Democratic Party?
Great question. The new identity of the Democratic Party is a bunch of things. It is progressive, it is young, it is of color, and it is radical. I think progressive is actually like too weak a term to convey the sensibility. The Progressive Caucus is one of the largest ones in Congress, but it includes a wide spectrum. And when I look at the voices like in the squad, and I'm thinking particularly of like the Cori Bushes and the Ilhan Omars, the Jabal Bowmans, Mondaire Jones, these are voices who come from their communities, stand for principles, and are challenging that corporate consensus in the Democratic Party. I think ultimately the new face of the Democratic Party is one that is actually democratic and answerable to our communities, instead of one that puts capital first. Basically, the establishment Democrats you're talking about, and I wouldn't say it's the long established identity of the party. This really happened in the 80s and 90s. The Democratic Party was a labor party until it got co-opted by Wall Street under Clinton. And it has been a Wall Street party for the last 30 years. But the future of the Democratic Party is returning to its roots in FDR's vision, returning to its roots in committing itself and ourselves to universal human rights, including a right to housing, a right to food, a right to healthcare. These are basic human needs, and they should be basic human rights. And that's what the Democratic Party should stand for. It's what it used to stand for 100 years ago. And it's what we will stand for again once we wrest the reins free from the capitalists who co-opted the party over the last generation.
So progressives have been maybe mischaracterized as anti-establishment. What do you say about that?
There are many progressives, or people who call themselves progressives, who embody the establishment. Nancy Pelosi, for instance, has famously said, "I'm a progressive." Well, if she's a progressive, then the word means nothing effectively, and other than establishmentarian. It emerged, progressive, in the contemporary political parlance as an alternative to liberal, because liberal was basically weaponized by the right wing and frankly contorted against itself. I'm always struggle with the question of like, is there time to chase this rabbit and unpack the random, seemingly interesting thing? I think there might be here. What we call liberals are not liberal. Liberals are authoritarians. And it pains me to say it, but it's true. Liberals, the word is supposed to mean committed to liberty. But contemporary liberals champion predatory policing. They champion mass surveillance. They said, we're going to look forward and not backward on torture. Liberals, the people who call themselves liberals today, are the ones who are deferring to executive power. It is profoundly perverse. And it's important to call out the co-optation of the term. That's why the word progressive emerged, because liberals stopped being liberal a long time ago. If I may, for some people might be interested in this gloss, the distinction between liberal and libertarian is very critical. Libertarians are people who also believe in liberty, but they don't recognize, unlike progressives, that the things we have to be liberated from include not only abusive government control, but also predatory markets in which we're forced to compete with unequal bargaining power. Desperation makes the market predatory, and that's why we have to be liberated from it too. So there's sort of stages of an awareness of liberation. and to recognize the need for Black and brown liberation, not just from predatory policing, but from, for instance, commercial redlining and the recurring destruction and theft of intergenerational Black wealth. We have that problem right here in San Francisco. I want to call out 3 quick neighborhoods. This is important as long as we're talking about, race in this context. Mm-hmm. The Fillmore was a historic Black neighborhood in San Francisco. It was sort of the site of the West Coast jazz scene at one point. Bayview and the Hunters Point, every single one of them reflect profound, continuing white supremacy in America's most proudly progressive city. So the Fillmore was destroyed in the 70s and 80s by an urban renewal project that just destroyed Black wealth, homes, hundreds of homes owned by Black families who were dispossessed and displaced. It exists as a neighborhood today, but as a shadow of its former self. And it exemplifies dynamic, not unlike the Tulsa massacre, which thankfully, we at least commemorated recently without having done anything to deal with it meaningfully. Beyond the Fillmore, Bayview and the Hunters Point, they are the last 2 remaining Black neighborhoods in San Francisco. And they were both poisoned by the US Navy for 50 years. The same place where we built the bombs that we dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we poisoned the whole neighborhoods because the neighborhoods where the bombs were built ended up getting radiation exposure so bad that the asthma rates and the breast cancer rates in Bayview and the Hunters Point are through the roof. They're among the worst in the country. They're among the worst in the world. This is the nation's most proudly progressive city. It's represented in Washington by the most powerful member of Congress, and I haven't seen her do anything for my Black and brown neighbors who have to sign property covenants when they move into the neighborhood, committing them not to grow any vegetables out of the soil because it will be too toxic to eat. Why are we building housing on this land? Nancy Pelosi engineered the privatization deal that privatized the land for her real estate development supporters. This is corruption of the highest order, corruption with devastating consequences to human rights, again, completely unobserved, overlooked, suppressed, ignored by our state-controlled media. And I am ultimately, when I talk about, liberating us, it's not just an abstract fight against these remote federal agencies. I see the same dynamic here locally, right? I mean, someone needs to fight for the Bayview and Hunters Point in Washington because it's the Navy ultimately that did this, right? Somebody has to stop the recurring theft of Black wealth, not just at the local level in cities and around the country, but at the federal level to make sure that agencies aren't off the rails and effectuating these kinds of behaviors. And I see this as it gets really sharp in everything from the oversight context of federal agencies, like the role that the Judiciary Committee plays in overseeing the FBI or the Justice Department's grants to local police departments. And it also comes in the antitrust arena when we talk about oversight of the economy that Congress effectuates or chooses not to for 30 years. There are lots of arenas where, unfortunately, people of all kinds are getting steamrolled, particularly Black and brown low-income communities, and they need allies. And having been an ally from the streets to the Hall of Congress before, while witnessing corporate Democrats and this is a couple different ways to put this. You could think about corporate Democrats putting their corporate donors before their constituents. You could think about corporate donors putting their own stock portfolios before their constituents. You could think about corporate Democrats putting the past in front of the future. Every one of those lenses fits. And every one of those lenses is disqualifying. The future needs advocates. And, I'm proud to have stood for it over and over again. When I was just out of law school, I had a chance to file one of the first marriage equality cases for LGBTQ couples in the country. And this weekend, we celebrated the anniversary of the Obergefell decision, which made marriage equality a federal right. When I was in court in New York State, it wasn't popular. My client, Jason West, he was the former mayor of New Paltz, New York. He's the only official in the country who was criminally prosecuted for standing for the freedom to marry. And it wasn't popular. I mean, in fact, every gay rights organization at the time was too timid to bring the suits. The mayor came to us at the law firm I worked for because the gay rights organizations didn't want to do it. And we knew we'd lose the case and we knew we'd win the war. And that's exactly what happened. And I give enormous credit to all of the activators, the agitators, the people who are willing to take action when others are not. Especially around these visionary principles, and to establish new rights in a relatively conservative time. I frankly think of that as one of the few bright spots of the last generation. And I'm very proud, especially as a Muslim, to have stood for gay rights in the United States. I think there is a crucial principle of intersectionality and to defend each other from whatever it is we might face. I'm not a gay person, but I'm an ally to all people. And that's what it's about ultimately, right? It's about putting our shared humanity first. And when we think about that arc from 2004 to now, where it's just taken for granted, I see so many families that are able to not only be recognized by the state, but to have families. I mean, the aspiration of people to have families, however they were situated, is one that you just could not even do 20 years ago. And I've seen society shift in a dramatic way in a relatively short time. And it frankly is among the things that emboldened me about the possibility of change. So many things that people defer to because they can't imagine a different way, because they can't imagine change ever happening. I've seen change happen. I've helped make it happen. I've seen seemingly impossible things become real. We all have. I mean, a black president was unthinkable at some points. And I don't want to chase the rabbit of the Obama administration's policy record, because it was profoundly disappointing. And I spent his entire time in Washington fighting him from the left. That also was unpopular. Running against the leader of the Democratic Party is often unpopular. But the key at the moment, the difference between a political view and a constitutional view, I don't care what's popular. It doesn't interest me in the least. I do what's right. And I just keep getting vindicated over and over again by events, because when you stand on principle, go figure, it's not that hard to be right. You just have to have an awareness of history and the context. And too many people, particularly journalists and policymakers, for whatever reason, don't. And I would hope that voters might look at the policy records of the choices before us and frankly choose better voices to make better choices in Washington, frankly, to protect the future and everybody's grandchildren from whether it's the climate chaos that is already here, literally this weekend also, record-setting temperatures being set across the West Coast. This state is poised to burn again. I think every Californian wakes up, in some amount of trepidation and fear, like, was there another wildfire that might have started last night? And we have voices in Washington who just seem like they couldn't care less. And the future isn't here yet to defend itself. It's one reason why I think it falls to all of us who are to show up.
Right. To stand up for it. I completely agree with that. I'm going to get into our last question.
Okay.
What advice do you have for someone who's just getting started in politics?
Listen and show up. Anywhere you are, wherever you are, there's going to be some organization talking about some set of issues. Maybe they're hosting meetings at your library. Maybe they've got flyers up at the local coffee shop. Maybe you're going to find out about it online. But the point is, whatever you care about in your community, somebody else is probably on it already. Just go to the event, go to the discussion, show up at the Zoom and listen. Don't presume at the outset like you have any answers. If you do, maybe share them with someone, but just show up in solidarity. The essence of solidarity is to learn and take direction from people who are most impacted on the front lines, to recognize your privileges and redeploy them in the service of people less fortunate, hopefully in some way that leverages your privilege to diminish them. And that takes, they call it praxis for a reason. It's sort of an interplay between practice and theory. So it's showing up, listening and learning. It's reading the books. I see a lot of people who want to care getting lost in books. Books you can learn a lot from them and they're important. And you have to also close the book and show up at some point. It's not enough to learn and study. Writing and learning and studying matters. We have to also literally show up. It is that simple. What happens in these spaces when you show up, you'll hear people who are talking about issues that they've encountered in their neighborhoods that maybe you hadn't heard about before. They'll have perspectives that will expand your own. They'll have requests and needs that you might be in a position to help fill. And the essence of organizing is simply like looking for ways to be helpful, because that's what all organizing is there's a need for this event or this campaign or this process to happen. Who's in the room? Who's got what resources, what background, what expertise, what networks. Let's pool our resources, our networks, our expertise, and let's do something together. What is the thing is the ultimate question in any space. And this is maybe a key I would offer people. It's not enough to gnash our teeth. Whatever frustrates you, talk about it with your friends, by all means, but get to the solutions, the most critical part of the conversation. And most people fall off before they ever get there. When you're talking to your friend late at night and you're pissed off, maybe that we just bombed Syria and Iraq, whatever it is that you're complaining about with your friends, and have that conversation, but then get to the point where you ask the question, what can we together do about it? And if you can't think of anything else, just write that letter and take it to your neighbors and get it to your city council. That's a super easy thing to do. You can do it you can write a letter in an hour. You can, tape it on your neighbor's doors and, come back the next day to pick up whoever signs it or whatever, right? If you have a listserv of your friends, if you put it out over email to a couple of people who live in your same city, this is not a laborious process. It's not like building Rome or something, right? It's pretty discreet. It's pretty painless. So write a letter, get some people to sign it. So easy. And it matters so much because frankly, nobody does it. The people who do it a lot are the insert trade association here and corporation XYZ. They write letters incessantly to lobby on their own behalf, but people don't do it. And I don't want to claim that it's enough, because any number of letters to your city council people and calls, they're not going to, frankly, change the stripes on the tiger, but it at least gets your foot in the door as an advocate. And that's step one. Now, a lot of other fights are going to emerge after you get step one, but the first step on the road is just asking the question in any space of other people, what can we together do about this? And I just want to double, triple underscore that, highlight it, bold it, draw a circle around it, whatever. If you're interested in politics, ask the question of whoever you're with, what can we do about this? And different people will give you different answers, and that will unlock opportunities. For some people, it's going to be the letter. For some people, you're going to occupy a public square and set off a national revolution. For some people, you're going to found a nonprofit organization and build an institution to do something over years that nobody could do just alone. Some people are going to find a direct action project to assert themselves at a point of intervention, like shutting down a weapons manufacturer, like we did in 2003. Some people might fall on a mutual aid project and, okay, let's have a soup circle and just make sure that we, in our neighborhood, we've got 10 people, once every 10 days, everybody's making soup for the others. That kind of stuff's profound. It matters a lot, whatever it is. And then maybe the other principle I'd offer here is it doesn't matter what it is. Just make it something. Do something. The essence, the key at the moment is that we throw all the spaghetti at the fridge as a civilization, and the spaghetti is in the pot, not on the fridge. The key to the spaghetti hitting the fridge is people throwing it, right? Do something. Whatever it is, I don't care. Just do something. Don't gnash your teeth. Don't settle for critique. And don't stop short of the question, what can we together do?
I love that answer. Listen and then ask the question, what can we do together? And then take action. Make sure you take action, right?
Yes.
Ask that question and then take action. I love that response. Thank you, Shahid. This has been a fantastic interview. I learned so much from you. You're such a knowledgeable person, and it shows through every response, through every point that you made, that you really care about the people. You really care about standing up for the we, standing up for the capital W, and making sure that every decision you take is in, you're keeping in mind the people and not your personal interest or any other donor or corporation that you could possibly benefit. So I really love that about you. I really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you, Shahid. Thank you so much for taking out this time. And everybody,
it's my honor.
Yeah, definitely. And everybody in the audience that, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the comments, and I will make sure to pass it on to Shahid so he could he could answer those questions. Or if you want to reach out to Shahid, where can they reach you?
Yeah, folks can find us online at shahidforchange.us. We're also active on all the social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, at Shahid for Change. And I'd be thrilled to hear from any of your listeners. Thank you again for bringing me on. This is a great conversation to have. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So again, I put that link in the comments. It says shahidforchange.us. Hit him up on the website, and he will be glad to reach out to you and have a conversation with you. Thank you, Shahid, for your time. Everybody, love and abundance, and I'll see you very soon. Peace.